The Little Old Engine by the Reverend W. Awdry. Read and adapted by Joshua Boston. Rusty helps Peter Sam. Every day where the little engines work, the crisp air is suddenly filled with a familiar noise. The lakes and mountains have many visitors, and Harold the helicopter flies the sky, making sure that no one is in trouble. "All present and correct. Time to return to base," he said one day after making his routine flyby. Then Harold noticed something. A sturdy diesel was coming around the mountain. Harold flew lower for a closer inspection. "I'm Harold. Who are you?"
"I'm Rusty,"
answered the diesel. "Don't recall seeing you before. What brings you this way?"
"The thin controller, Mr. Percival, bought me to help the other engines."
This was no time to chat with a helicopter. "Well done. Cheers, and keep up the good work,"
"Cheeky chopper,"
muttered Rusty. "Not long now," encouraged the driver as they set off again. "We'll soon be at the top station." Sir Handel and Peter Sam were glad to see Rusty. They had had hard work while Skarloey was away. The owner had given them buffers and even promised for Rusty to help them out. Even so, Sir Handel grumbled continually. The cars didn't like Sir Handel and wanted to play tricks on him. He was shunting furiously when Gordon arrived. "Mr. Percival makes me shunt," Sir Handel said sheepishly, "and take cars to quarries too. I'm highly sprung and suffer dreadfully." "Our controllers don't understand our feelings," sympathized Gordon. "Now, if you were ill," he winked as he continued, "you couldn't shunt cars, could you?" "Great idea," said Sir Handel. "I'll try it out." He did so the next morning. "I don't feel well," he groaned. There wasn't any time to examine him, so some of the freight cars were coupled up behind Peter Sam's coaches, and Rusty promised to follow with the rest. Sniggered Sir Handel, but no one noticed. They were all too busy. Peter Sam didn't mind the extra work. He left his coaches at the top station and trundled cheerfully through the woods. The cars chattered behind him in an agitated way, but he paid no attention. It might have been better if he had. Slates come from quarries high up in the hills. They traveled down in freight cars on a steep railway called an incline. Empty cars at the bottom are hitched to a rope. Loaded ones at the top are hitched to another. By their weight, the loaded ones run down the incline, pulling up empty ones. There are strong brakes in the winding house at the top to prevent loaded ones from running down too fast. The ropes are very strong too. But in spite of this, cars sometimes play dangerous tricks. Now, Peter Sam did not bump freight cars unless they misbehaved. Sir Handel bumped them even if they were good, so they didn't like him and played tricks whenever they could. Peter Sam pushed his empty freight cars into a siding where his driver hitched them to a rope. Then on another siding, he pulled some loaded cars. With these in front of him, he stood dutifully waiting for more loaded cars, which stood at the top of the incline, ready to come down. But they couldn't see him properly. They thought he was Sir Handel and wanted to pay him out. The cars began to move. "Faster! Faster!" they grumbled. They reached halfway, gathering speed. "Scratch him! Scratch him!" they yelled, for their chance for trickery had come. "No! No! No!" wailed the empty cars. "It's Peter Sam! It's Peter Sam!" But it was no use. The loaded cars were straining on the rope. They broke it with a crack. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" they roared, hurtling down the hill. Peter Sam heard them and shut his eyes. His driver and fireman crouched in his cab. The crash jerked him violently backwards. "Ouch!" he shivered. "I didn't expect a cold bath." The water poured from a channel smashed by flying slates. He was soaked from funnel to cab. "Beep, beep," wailed Peter Sam weakly. Rusty was working nearby, and he came up with a toot from his horn.
Bust my buffers!
Exclaimed Rusty.
What a mess! Never mind, Peter Sam. We'll get you out.
He soon pulled him from the water and the broken cars. Peter Sam felt battered. His funnel was cracked and his boiler dented. But he was glad that his driver and firemen were unhurt. He thanked Rusty and limped slowly home. Rusty stayed to help clear up the wreckage. "I'm sorry about your accident," said Sir Handel to Peter Sam. "I always stand well back. Cars don't like me." "Why didn't you warn me?" screamed Peter Sam. "I didn't think," Sir Handel said in a hurt voice. "You never do," said a stern voice. It was Mr. Percival. "You can start now while you are doing Peter Sam's work as well as your own. That will teach you to pretend you are ill." Sir Handel did start thinking. He thought about thin controllers, and he thought about Gordon. He wanted to give Gordon a piece of his mind. When the wreckage was cleared away at the quarry, Rusty set off along the line. Presently he heard a familiar buzzing. "Splendid to see you again," whizzed Harold. "I'm completing my evening's lookabout."
Well done. Cheers. And keep up the good work.
And the little diesel purred back home. Home at last. Skarloey had been to the works to be mended. He felt much better. Rusty the diesel was helping him off his rail car. Skarloey hadn't met the little diesel before. "Rusty seems a kindly sort of engine," he thought to himself.
I help mend the line and do odd jobs.
Explained Rusty.
I hear that everyone's looking forward to seeing you again. Come on.
They coupled Skarloey behind the diesel and set off for the sheds. Peter Sam was feeling depressed. He was still getting over his accident, but he wanted to start work again. But Mr. Percival wouldn't let him. "Another day's rest will do you good," he said. "Besides, I've got a surprise for you." "For me, sir? How nice, sir. What is it, sir?" "Wait and see," smiled Mr. Percival. The surprise was Skarloey. "Oh," said Peter Sam, "I am so glad you've come home." They lit Skarloey's fire, and he sizzled happily. "I feel all excited," he said, "just like a young engine. I am longing to pull my dear old coaches again. Are they running nicely?" "Yes, they're running well," said Peter Sam, "but we have 5 other coaches now." Skarloey was interested. "Oh," he said, "tell me about them." "Cora is a conductor's van. She's not as big as Beatrice, and she hasn't got a ticket window, but I like her best. She was my conductor's van in the old days. Ada, Jane, and Mabel are plain. They have no roofs. Sir Handel calls them freight cars. But they have seats," said Peter Sam, "so I call them coaches. What do you think, Skarloey?" The old engine smiled. "If they have seats, they are coaches," he said firmly. "Sir Handel likes Gertrude and Millicent best," Peter Sam went on. "He always tries to take them alone. They have bogies, and he says they're the only real coaches we have. They remind him of when he used to pull our express. Both have seats for passengers, but Millicent has a conductor as well. He sells tickets and travels in a tiny cupboard place. I don't like that," he remarked earnestly. "Conductors are very important. They need vans. They shouldn't be put into cupboards." Skarloey said nothing, so Peter Sam continued. "I see you've met Rusty. Did he help you off your rail car?" "Yes. He says he's come to mend the line and do odd jobs. I like him," smiled Skarloey. "So do I." Peter Sam explained how kind Rusty was when he had his accident. "It's a pity Duncan doesn't like him." "Who is Duncan?" "He came as a spare engine after my accident. Is he useful?
He'll pull anything. He keeps busy, and I'm sure he means well, but he's bouncy and rude. He used to work at a factory, and his language is often strong. He sings and sways and swivels around. His driver calls it rock and roll.
I understand, said Skarloey gravely. Just then the telephone rang, and Skarloey's driver and fireman climbed into his cab. Come on, old boy, they said. Duncan has done it again. He's stuck in a tunnel, and we'll have to get him out. Skarloey was pleased. He wanted a run and looked forward to meeting Duncan. They found Cora and some workmen and hurried along the line. How nice and smooth the rails are, thought Skarloey. Looks like they've mended all the old bumps, and Rusty has helped to do that. What a difference he's made to the line. I must tell him how nice it is. Quite soon, they found Duncan. He had stuck at the far end of the tunnel. His coaches were outside, and the passengers were helping the driver and firemen to dislodge some rocks wedged between the top of his cab and the tunnel roof. Duncan was very cross. I'm a plain, blunt engine, he kept saying. I speak as I find. Tunnels should be tunnels and not rabbit holes. This railway is no good at all. Don't be silly, snapped his driver. This tunnel is quite big enough for engines who do not rock and roll. It took a very long time for them to clear away the rocks and set Duncan free again. At last, Skarloey was able to pull Duncan and his coaches safely through. Cora was left on the siding, and the workmen stayed to make sure that everything was safe. Duncan grumbled all the way home, but Skarloey paid no attention. That evening, Sir Topham Hatt came up with Mr. Percival and spoke severely to Duncan. He had been on the train as a trial inspector for the Scottish engine. Listen to me. There is nothing wrong with that tunnel. You stuck in it because you tried to do rock and roll. Tunnels are not dance floors, and you are not a pop star. Then Sir Topham Hatt paid special attention to Duncan's funnel. If it happens again, he ended ominously, I shall ask Mr. Percival to find ways to cut you down to size. In other words, your career is on the line. Need I say more? Duncan felt that Sir Topham Hatt had said quite enough, and being quite abashed, he was neither plain or blunt, and remained completely still and silent, for at least a whole evening. Rock and roll. Skarloey loves all the sights and sounds all around his line, and he knows them very well. One morning, soon after he returned from being mended, he was enjoying his journey more than ever before. He was glad to take out the coaches and meet old friends. Along the way, he met Rusty. You know, he said, if I couldn't see the old familiar faces and places, I'd think I was on a different railway. You've done wonders with these rails. Rusty laughed.
Oh, I'm glad you're pleased. We hoped you would. Mr. Hugh, our foreman, said, Rusty, Skarloey is coming home. Let's mend the track so well he doesn't know where he is. And we did, and you didn't, if you take my meaning.
Skarloey chuckled away. He liked this hard-working, friendly little diesel.
Oh, there's still one bad bit,
said Rusty anxiously that evening.
It's just before the first station. We haven't had time to mend it yet.
Never mind, said Skarloey. It's much better than it was.
It may be better, but it's not good,
replied Rusty.
An engine might come off there. Peter, Sam and Sir Handel take care, as do you. But I'm worried about Duncan. He will do rock and roll along the line. I shouldn't like to see his passengers hurt.
What's that about me? I'm a plain engine, and I believe in plain speaking. Speak up, and stop whispering in corners. Rusty warned Duncan about the bad bit of line. He grunted. I knew me we about, thank you very much. I don't need smelly diesels to tell me what to do. Rusty looked hurt. Never mind, said Skarloey. You've done your best. He said no more, but thought a great deal. The next day, Rusty left Duncan to fetch his own coaches. Duncan snorted and banged around the yard. Then he clattered crossly to the station. James was already there waiting for him. You're late, he snapped. I know, said Duncan. It's a smelly diesel's fault. Rusty thinks he can teach me to stay on the rails, then goes off and leaves me to find my own coaches. You poor engine, sympathized James. I know all about diesels. One crept into our yard and ordered us about. I soon sent him packing. Duncan gazed at James admiringly. He didn't know that James was boastful, and sometimes didn't tell the truth. Send the Rusty packing! Send the Rusty packing! Snorted Duncan. He climbed the first hill furiously. Well done, boy! Keep it up! Encouraged his driver. They were soon near the first station. Duncan was pleased. Nothing's happened! Nothing's happened! He chortled. Silly old diesel, clever to me! And he swaggered along, doing his rock and roll along the line. Steady, boy! His driver tried to check him, but it was too late. There was a tearing, cracking, crunching sound, and Duncan stopped bumpily. Sleepers and ballast, I'm off! And he was.
I warned him,
said Rusty.
Duncan, I said, you be careful on that bit of line, but all he did was call me names.
Mr. Hugh, the foreman, kept turning Rusty's handle. Come on, he urged. Start up! The little diesel refused to move.
No, Mr. Hugh, sir. I'm sorry to disoblige, but I won't help that Duncan.
I'm ashamed of you, Rusty, said Skarloey severely. Think of the passengers. What are they going to do?
Oh,
said Rusty.
Oh, I'd forgotten about them. I'm sorry, Mr. Hugh, sir. We must help the passengers.
And his engine roared into life. Duncan stood sad and solitary. He couldn't rock and roll now. Oh dear, he thought. Everyone will know how silly I am. Presently, Mr. Hugh and Rusty brought sleepers and old rails. Mr. Hugh showed the passengers how to use them. They weren't very pleased about that, but worked as hard as they could. They carefully levered Duncan back onto the line. After that, Duncan was extra careful all day. At last, evening came. Rusty, he whispered, thank you for helping. I'm sorry I was rude to you.
Oh, that's all right, Duncan,
smiled the diesel. I wish all diesels were like you. Let's be friends.
Suits me,
said Rusty.
We'll mend that bad bit of rail first thing tomorrow.
Little Old Twins. One day, the owner brought lots of people to see the railway. He showed them everything. They traveled in the trains and looked at stations and bridges and coaches. Yes, they would say thoughtfully, we'll take this. Or, no, we won't take that. They made notes in their books. Peter Sam whispered to Sir Handel,
Men came and did sat on our old line.
And then, said Sir Handel, soon afterwards it was sold, finished Peter Sam mournfully. Peter Sam didn't sing any more. He wanted to cry. The other engines were sad too. What's the matter with you all? His driver asked him one day. You look like dying ducks.
We don't want to be sold,
said Peter Sam miserably. Sold? The driver was surprised. Who to?
To those people who came and talked about taking things.
You silly engine, laughed his driver. They're not going to buy us. They're going to film us and take pictures of us on television. And he tried to explain what that meant. Not going to be sold, not going to be sold, sang Peter Sam. He could hardly wait to tell the others. He told them about the television as well, and they were pleased and excited too. All except Sir Handel. "I don't hold with it," he grumbled. "Vulgar, I call it. Fancy trancing about making an exhibition of yourselves. I won't do it, I tell you. Tell me something indeed. Just let Mr. Percival come here. I'll tell him something." Skarloey said nothing. He just winked at Peter Sam. But the next morning, when Mr. Percival did come to explain about the television, Sir Handel kept strangely quiet. "Now," said Mr. Percival at last, "I want every engine to take part." I don't feel well," quavered Sir Handel. "You poor engine," said Mr. Percival gravely. "You can stay in the shed." Sir Handel smiled broadly. "And your driver and fireman shall take you to pieces. That will make an interesting picture. Just what we need." Sir Handel's feelings were beyond words. "That's that," said Mr. Percival. "Now, Skarloey, will you take Agnes, Ruth, Jemima, Lucy, and Beatrice?" "Yes, please, sir. I was hoping you would let me have them." "Duncan shall have a goods train, while Rusty with Mr. Hugh and the men can show how we mend the line."
"Please, sir, what about me, sir?"
asked Peter Sam anxiously. Mr. Percival smiled. "You, Peter Sam, shall pull the special television train."
"Oh, sir! Oh, sir!"
bubbled Peter Sam in ecstasy. The television men built towers for cameras beside the line. They put cameras on Ada, too, and filled Gertrude with wires and instruments. Some freight cars coupled behind carried cables and generators. Everyone practiced hard till they knew just what they had to do. At last, the time came, and the announcer gave the signal.
"We're on the air! We're on the air!"
puffed Peter Sam, and he rolled the heavy train to the shops where Sir Handel was being mended. Sir Handel did not enjoy their visit.
"We're on the air! We're on the air!"
chanted Peter Sam. He trundled over the bridge near the middle station.
"Beep, beep!"
he whistled to Duncan.
"We're coming!"
The announcer talked to Duncan, and then they puffed over the second bridge to a quarry siding where Rusty, Mr. Hugh, and the men were waiting to explain about their work. Soon they had to go. Peter Sam whistled, Rusty tooted in reply, and they clattered through the tunnel, rumbled over the viaduct near the waterfall, and rolled at last into the top station. The owner climbed down. "We arranged for television," he said, "to let everyone see our little old engine. We are proud of him. 95 years old and good as new. There's nothing like him anywhere. 3 cheers for Skarloey!" "Beep, beep, beep!" whistled Peter Sam, and everybody joined in. Skarloey smiled. "I'm very glad to be home again. Thank you, sir, and all, for your nice surprise. Now, I'll surprise you. Listen. When I was mended in England, I found my twin." The owner stared. "Is there really another engine like you?" "Yes, sir," chuckled Skarloey. "There is. Another engine came to be mended too, called Talilin. When the workmen saw us together, they laughed and called us their old little twins. Talilin told me about his railway. It's a lovely one, at Tone in Wales. Well, sir, they mended us both and sent us home. But I often think of Talilin. He's 95 years old, just like me. Please go to see him, all of you, and wish him dry rails and good running from Skarloey, his little old twin."